Welcome to the Cross Cultural Psych podcast with Professor Paul Youngbin Kim. This podcast features conversations on the intersection of psychology, culture, and faith with renowned scholars in psychology and related fields. And now, here's Dr. Paul Youngbin Kim.
Today I have Dr. Jordan Shannon here, and Jordan is an assistant professor of counselor education at Seattle Pacific University. Back in March, I had the pleasure of collaborating with Jordan and Dr. Peter Rivera, who's an assistant professor of marriage and family therapy at SPU, on a 3-part blog series focused on what it's like to teach DEI-focused courses as people of color, as faculty of color at a Christian institution. So I wanted to converse a little bit more with Jordan about that. So thanks, Jordan, for being here.
My pleasure.
As a way of introduction, maybe you could talk a little bit about what DEI-focused courses you teach. Is there one class that you teach or maybe multiple? And who are the students who are required to take this class? And how often do you teach it?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a counselor educator. My program is particularly focused on training graduate level counselors. Every counseling program has to take a course on what they call multiculturalism or multicultural issues. Places call it diversity and social justice. Some places call it cultural foundations. Our program, we call it multicultural counseling in the schools. And it's particularly designed for school counselors to build their cultural competency in working with diverse clients, diverse students. This is my second time teaching, actually teaching it right now during this quarter. So this topic is very fresh. What I appreciate is that it is a required part of our curriculum.
In all of our blog pieces, we reflected on how there's a temptation to cater to the fragility of our students when we're teaching these classes. So you use the phrase that it feels like tightroping, which I thought was a really powerful analogy. You might feel convicted to teach about a topic in a particular way, but then maybe because you are afraid or I'm afraid of how the students might receive it, we might cater to those tendencies. So I'm curious, can you think of any examples, Jordan, of where an assignment or maybe even a conversation with a student where you felt like you come to that temptation?
It's interesting because there's many ways where I felt like I've succumbed to it, and then there's also ways I feel like I've challenged it. So let me start with the first part of your question, which was succumbing to it. So every week I have my students complete reflections where they specifically from one of our textbooks. It's a workbook called the Racial Healing Handbook. It's 10 chapters, which coincides perfectly for our quarter system, and they complete them. And then the first 45 minutes to an hour of class each week is just processing the experience of completing those reflections. And I intentionally designed it that way to be kind of like this experiential growth group component.
Right.
Now, there are times in those classes where I could really be challenging my students on some of the microaggressions that they're enacting, specifically towards fellow students of color in that class. The main one is silence, where when a student of color is sharing about their experiences, it's usually met with just silence from white peers. It can be very hard for them to respond. And it reiterates this aspect of racism is only experienced by folks of color. And I think the frustrating part of that is, while I have this balancing act of, okay, I want to protect my students of color, but I also don't want to shame my white students, even though, like, in many ways, just bringing things into awareness can spark shame and guilt and those insecurities that come up with fragility. I've seen that happen a couple times this quarter in my growth group, where students of color will share their experiences and white students are just audibly silent. At the very least, how can we show empathy? Just acknowledge like how vulnerable that was to share. Right. And how sacred that is to share in this space, because they didn't have to share that. That's very protected information. Yeah. As a professor, I have to do a better job of modeling that and broaching that, because I can't expect my white students to do that, frankly. Right. As much as I would love to believe that they would do that, but it really does make me have to put me in the seat of, okay, I'm seeing this, and I'm also privy to it as a faculty of color. So now let me bring this really into the here and now, like really focus on how this is enacting presently. On the flip side, on the challenging aspect, you have a small minority every now and then that just tells you pretty boldly how to do things within your coursework. And in particular, I had this student, male, white, and when I assigned my texts to the class, he started reading them. He really felt driven and everything of that nature. But then he emails me maybe 2 or 3 days before the class starts and says, "Hey, I have some concerns about our book. This seems to talk more about critical race theory than it does about multiculturalism." To which I retorted, I said, "Hey, I'm sorry that's the impression that you're getting, that these two things do not coexist, but they absolutely can. And that the book actually, it mentions critical race theory, but it doesn't focus on it." So I talked about selecting those courses, and he talked about his concerns with that
Yeah.
text. And then he also said, "I was thinking of texts such as these that would be more relevant to multicultural counseling." He provided suggestions of texts for me to revise for my curriculum. He's like, "I'm sure you had a great reason for choosing these texts, and I look forward to hearing them, but I must suggest you consider revising the text." And I pushed back. I pushed back in my email. I said, "Hey, so just to be clear, I recognize the shock of the information that you're being confronted with these texts and the resources, but I think talking about race and talking about racism specifically is very prevalent for bringing into the awareness, knowledge, and skills and development of cultural competency for school counselors." So I laid out like a very well thought out, well informed response. My student replies, "Hey, I got your reply. I still think it's not appropriate for a multicultural course, and I will send a more in-depth response later." So my student sends a response. He sees my colleague, not my supervisor, but my colleague, who's a tenured professor, white woman, supports me. But it's just, he CCs her on the email and says, "Hey, here's my issues with the text. I strongly suggest we revise all this stuff. Like, this has nothing to do with multicultural counseling." And I replied, "Hey, just so you know, sir, the person who wrote this text co-wrote our multicultural and social justice counseling competencies. So therefore, we're still using the text."
Right.
And then I CC'd my dean on the response because I was like, "Hey, if you want to go with the chain of command, I have no problem." And I felt very supportive, but it's painstakingly infuriating to just have to feel like I have to prove my education. And I've been consistently having to do this all quarter with this particular student. Even when I present with evidence-based literature, even when I present with resources, I still get pushed back. And that's hard. That's hard to sit with, especially when you have interactions with people who seem very personable and likable and things of that nature.
Right.
But it also tells me that I need to do more of that challenging, because frankly, what I'm more nervous about is if I'm feeling this way as a faculty member who has a PhD, who's published on this, who's taught this course before, and if I'm feeling this distress from the microaggressions that the student has committed against me, I can only imagine how that's going to impact my future K-12 students if this student were to get into practicum or internship. So it is a balance. It's like, okay, I do need to challenge, and how do I do that? How do I do that both in the group space that doesn't necessarily provoke shaming and guilt, but also how do I do that also maintaining that on the individual level of, no, this is what we're going to teach, and this is topics we're going to cover, and this is what's best practice as well.
Thank you for sharing that example. I know it's painful to talk about these experiences, but I hope that talking about it can also help you process and to experience some kind of, I guess, healing and validation that, oh gosh, this is a bunch of microaggressions put together directed to you. I think the invalidation of you as a scholar because you're teaching about this topic, or the fact that they're accusing you or me of having an agenda, all of these are experiences that we can speak to, right? If we can stay with the topic of microaggressions, what are some other themes that come up for you, especially in the context of a Christian university or a faith-based university? I feel like you already touched upon one example where maybe a microaggression is Professor Shannon should be teaching more inclusively instead of teaching about these divisive topics? I get those themes a lot.
Probably the biggest one from students that I experience is this aspect of like my ascription of my intelligence, right? And particularly around Professor Shannon is teaching this class this way on divisive issues. Why isn't he talking more about the positive aspects of identity? Why isn't he talking about, all these other cultural variables that impact identity as well? And even just like I shared about that student saying that's not multicultural, right? Even though I've done the research on what multiculturalism is, I've taken coursework on it, I've taught on it, I've done all these things, but there's no benefit of the doubt that this is just truly best practice. At the end of the day, I'm grounded in the fact that I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be and I'm qualified to be doing this work.
Right.
But, I can always play that psychological game of imposter syndrome. Am I in the right space or am I teaching this right way? And really kind of second guessing some of those aspects of my identity. Another one that can come up from students from side that say like, oh, this is not inclusive enough. Like it actually comes from students who are also liberal, right? Like openly giving me feedback, even when I push them to reflect more on their racial conscious, there's still that essence of distrust towards me. I do want to be mindful of that and be open to that feedback, which is where, student evaluations can be helpful.
Yeah.
And also they can just be very negatively biased. So it's
goodness. So cruel.
So that's where I'm like, what do I do with that? How do I make sense of that? So a lot of it, I experience it from the students. I'm also thinking about ways I experience it outside of the classroom proper. So not necessarily connected with students, but really connected within just institutional kind of like environmental aspects, like structurally. So like, oh, Jordan's qualified to teach the multicultural, but I'm also a person of color. Like just kind of like this centralized aspect or component of just people of color should be teaching these courses. And while yes, there's aspects of my identity that are lived experience, what are we ultimately saying about faculty of color when we're relegating them to teach this course?
Right.
That historically has low evaluations, that has a lot of psychological distress. I teach it because I enjoy it and I'm connected to this, but at the same time, I was having a conversation with a colleague who's a professor of color and he taught multicultural and he stepped away. He said, I felt like they were coming from my identities as a queer person of color. Like, and I was like, I gotta stop. As much as I love this content, I need to stop. And I took a break from teaching it.
Yeah.
And I'm like, wow, like one, I appreciate that that person felt safe to do that and supported by their community to do that. And it just speaks to that psychological tax that folks of color experience having to teach that course. Or even like, for me, I mean, this is a larger issue, but I'm just thinking about folks of color being saturated with service projects and service opportunities. And I'm pre-tenure and yet I'm department chair. So it's a heavy hand to deal with during these times. And so all of that is more from like the institutional aspect when there are other folks who could be very much more. And it is not to say I'm not capable, but it's also not setting me up for my best interests in terms of building my identities as a scholar, as an educator. So all that to say, it just feels like institutionally wide and it extends beyond the classroom.
Thank you for sharing all that. I think I definitely want to talk about the institutional aspect as well. But your point about evaluation, especially pre-tenure, and being sensitive to the comments that come up, I mean, how can you not be sensitive to that, right? And then also thinking about sort of second guessing oneself, imposter syndrome, all of that I can relate to. And the other point about you being really passionate about this topic and having training in teaching this course, but at the same time, wondering like, am I being asked to teach this because I'm a person of color? I think those struggles can be really difficult. I'm similar in the sense that I enjoy teaching cross-cultural psychology. I have training in teaching it. I have life experiences that can speak into this area, but maybe because of my personal connection, I also feel at times unsure as to whether I'm really valued in teaching this class.
Yeah, it's almost like this is yours to teach and this is your identity and experiences. And then also students are going to connect that and make that generalized assumption that these are how all Black American folks are engaging or are taught in this way. You feel like you can't escape that, right? How do you teach outside of that? And I thought with my text that I selected, that was a way to try to teach that. But then something I'm just noticing, or maybe I've always noticed, and part of this might be just reflective of my own training, is that it's just a very hard place for faculty of color to talk about race. Like at the end of the day, it's going to be much more scrutinized, much more invalidated than if like a white professor did it. I remember in my master's program when my white professor did it, it was actually very validating for me. It was like, advocacy and support, but some students pushed back. I will admit that it didn't stop students from pushing back, but even though they pushed back, they found themselves even committing to the work a little bit more. I saw it from even just the anti-racist steps that they were taking and actions they were taking, and even just like the program even supported them towards that. So I thought to myself, I'm like, man, part of me almost feels jealous that I don't have that same power. But at the same time, am I saying that I wish I were white? No, but it's different, right? Like it's different if a faculty of color talks about race, because then you're perceived as having an agenda. You're perceived as being biased. You're perceived, even when I talk to my student about critical race, even when my student wanted to talk to me privately about critical race theory, the first thing he says, like, I want to ask you something. I don't want to assume. I want to ask if you are a proponent of critical race theory. And I said to myself, I was like, I believe it's a valid theory for counseling. There's evidence to support it. And then he went on to talk about, basically infer that I'm biased because I believe in critical race theory. And I just felt like, how unfair, right? Because even when I look at some of the reflections this student in particular completes, every time there's a comment that talks about microaggressions, he's like, I disagree, but doesn't necessarily offer academic support. So, I challenge him. I'm like, hey, this is not an academic argument. You actually need to back it up with, some peer-reviewed evidence. Otherwise, it actually comes across as personal bias. Like, I wonder if I were a white man or a white woman or a white person in general, would the pushback be the same? I don't know. I would largely think it would be less. There would probably still be some, because some of those values would likely be instilled, but there's something psychologically happening that the students become more receptive to it.
Right. Maybe the legitimacy depends on who is standing there as the professor, right? And we have to work doubly to convince the students that, this is based on evidence, not just our agenda, right? Or that we're not trying to impose our own agenda in the classroom, but we are saying, look at all this evidence that speaks to the validity of microaggressions, for example.
One thing that I did actually within this class is a pre-post test assessment, just because I wanted to kind of see, okay, how can I help facilitate this? I'm trying to build critical consciousness of my students, really trying to get them to analyze oppressive systems and think of ways to take action against them. And so this one in particular, the critical consciousness short measure, is about 35 items, but it measures like across racism, heterosexism, sexism, ableism, and religious oppression. And so the higher you score, the higher likelihood you have critical consciousness in these areas. So I showed them their pre-test, and they'll take the other one in a couple of weeks. But the pre-test one, this one student, so the highest score you can get on racism is 35, and the lowest score you can get is a 5. So this student that I spent much more time with scored an 8, to the point where it's not really surprising to see all this pushback in many ways. But at the same time, it does provide some validation of why I'm spending a lot of time with them, to be honest, because in many ways I'm like, okay, he needs a lot of support in this. But at the same time, I don't want to neglect the rest of my students, because the rest of my students scored, in the 20s and 30s. The average, actually, surprisingly, this was actually very interesting too, which in many ways justified talking about race. My students seem more critically conscious of ableism, heterosexism, and religious oppression. It was racism that was more moderate amongst the class, which I thought was very surprising. And I didn't know what to make of that, but I was like, okay, well, school counseling, particularly being a very white woman dominated field, We're going to processes. We're going to talk about just
Yeah.
how our awareness of racial identity is impacting our work with clients. In many ways, it helps, but at the same time, it does provide some sense of confirmation of there needs to be a lot more work in this area.
Right. And for students to see that, right, the score and reflect on that too. And for you to
Yeah.
say, look, this is why we need more conversations. These are areas that we can grow in. You mentioned talking to your wife about some of your emotional struggles as you're engaging some students and their work. And I think that's a good strategy, good coping strategy. Are there other coping strategies that you have, Jordan, when students microaggress against you, or for that matter, your colleagues might microaggress against you? Maybe you feel frustrated about the institution. What are some ways that, as a professional, but also as a person, you have coped with the microaggressions?
Sometimes the biggest support that has been is finding colleagues who have experienced similar things. And the main way I've done that recently is through writing, collaborating on different projects
Yeah.
with different faculty. And so
Mhm.
the colleague that I was telling you about who experienced this being a queer faculty of color, we're writing a piece right now. And it's not particularly related to teaching about diversity, equity. It helps to one, have a space of support to where we can talk about what's going on in our day to day, but also have a shared common objective. Like, so yesterday, for example,
Mm.
I was feeling behind on the reflections, a couple weeks behind,
Mm.
because they take a time. But after I graded this one student, I was like, I cannot do
Mm.
these again today because I feel like that took so much. So I spent the rest of the day yesterday writing. I spent the rest of the day like working on a manuscript, and that to me felt more life-giving and
Mhm.
encouraging and support. So I think a big one is just having those support systems like
Yeah.
with fellow colleagues who like even just this conversation frankly
Yeah.
is a helpful way of just us being able to talk and process, and that to me is really helpful because it is a lot. And I think it's very easy for me to get wrapped up in it. It's very easy for me to think about this interaction and think about, the microaggressions and, oh man, can't believe that they actually said that, right? Like, or I can't believe they actually believe this, or even when I present this, they're still doubling down. And it's like, okay, there's clearly not listening to me. What are some of the steps professionally? In the same vein, it also helps when I like talk about these things. Like professionally, I felt supported because I feel like one of the very few things that I would want to do is to put students on notice when it comes
Mhm.
to official disposition or remediation or documentation. But with talking with peers, even in my department and in my leadership, like my dean,
Yeah.
they all unanimously are like, no, there should be something documented and in play for this student. There are concerns. It really helped me to like feel grounded about the next steps of like remediation plan or disposition, just because this is the profession and this is a deficit where the student is being closed off to faculty feedback, being closed
Yeah.
off to new ideas. There's so much that's going on here that there needs to be notification about that. And so that to me was also very grounding. So processing it with professionals and then saying like, am I crazy for experiencing this? Like, no, not only are you not crazy, we need to be making sure that we're actually taking more severe action. Like I've actually heard more folks say, Jordan, you've been very gracious with the students, as opposed to being more like, Jordan, you're not seeing things, which to me is very helpful.
Yeah. To have your supervisors and colleagues validate you, but also say, hey, here's something else that you could do that is more forceful. I'm glad that you have that support. I imagine, Jordan, it's different in graduate programs, but when I taught undergraduate introduction psychology, I got all kinds of comments on my teaching evaluation. And sometimes I would say racist comments. Back then, I didn't have a good sense of who I could turn to process those racist comments other than my friends, my wife. So professionally, I kind of kept it to myself. Now looking back, I feel like it would have been good, like how you did, to involve my department chair, to involve my dean perhaps, and say, I know these are anonymous, so we can't really write up something as a remediation thing, but we can maybe recognize how hurtful and how traumatic these comments are. I didn't do
Yeah.
that. And my chair then was not able to recognize the unique stressor. I think their stance was more of we all get nasty responses on Corsica House, right? But
Yeah.
I didn't bring up, hey, but look at this particular comment that is very racist. Like this is a unique stressor of someone who's person of color starting out and teaching these large classes. So I'm glad that you have colleagues that you can talk to about that.
You touch upon an amazing point. If I had a different chair or dean that said things like, oh yeah, we all just get bad comments, like who doesn't kind of thing,
Mm,
I don't think I would feel safe to talk about what I'm
mm,
experiencing with this particular student.
right.
Funnily enough, my dean actually was meeting with me to talk about program updates. And they taught a class the previous semester and they taught my cohort of school counseling students. And so they're teaching that class. And so my dean is like, Jordan, I want to bring a student of concern to you. And
Mm,
so this student was posting things that were very colorblind, very just microaggressive and all these things. And it's okay to have conservative views, but these were just like
yeah.
ultra far right. And when he said that, I was like, is the student blank? And so he's like, yes. And I thought, funny you should mention that because I've had similar interactions in our multicultural class. And so that was another point of validation for me, just because then this is not just how I'm receiving the student, this is how another educator is receiving the student as well. And at the end of the day, I really should feel more grounded in many ways of taking actions and steps. But I wouldn't have felt that, honestly, if my dean did not share that information. I probably would have just been kept trying to have these really psychologically heavy conversations around where the student is engaging in color blindness, is challenging my intelligence, all these things. And I'm like, okay, well, I have to be patient and kind and gracious because I think people think of us at SPU, that Christian higher education, that we're very nice and kind, which I would like to be as well. I would like to do that. And there are things that we do need to challenge on. Like
Yeah.
this is a professional mandate to
Yeah.
be multiculturally and social justice
Yeah.
competent. And I think even just trying to navigate that is a unique space for Christian higher education in general, because how do you maintain standards that attend to what I believe values that are in congruence with Christianity,
Yeah.
diversity, equity, and inclusion. But because that can get tied so much to conservative rhetoric, and conservative rhetoric is also tied to evangelical Christian culture, and our institution being an evangelical institution, how do you balance that? And
Yeah.
that's a hard space to be in.
Yeah. Can we stay there? I know this is a hot topic for us on our campus and across the country, right? But it's
Absolutely.
also, like you said, it's tricky to navigate what it means to integrate faith into our classrooms, but also we have these standards, right? Disciplinary standards that we're adhering to. And so, Jordan, from your perspective, does DEI teaching on a Christian campus, does it look different? Or is it something that's very similar to, say, what happens on a public higher education institution? What are your
Yeah,
thoughts on that?
that's a great question. I think we're trying to make it look different, and I think it should look different than a public higher education institution. Having these conversations around racism, around
Yeah.
oppression, they're going to be very polarizing in general, especially in one of our tenets being ecumenical. And the truth is, I think to do it well, we shouldn't be trying to do it differently from how the other institutions are doing. We have to be comfortable having these uncomfortable conversations and challenging our students. And honestly, being okay with not looking nice while doing it, because they are matters of justice, they are matters of equity. And I think honestly, like that's also reflective of Jesus,
Mhm.
right? Because Jesus did not care if folks saw him. I believe Jesus was nice, but Jesus was also willing to say hard things
Right.
and risk his social image of being perceived as nice
Yeah.
so that people could hear the hard things. For us at SPU, and I would even argue for Christian higher education in general, there needs to be even a change in the public perception of what they think Christian higher education is, because
Right.
the truth is DEI should be taught across the board, frankly, and it's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to challenge you, and it might invoke feelings of guilt and shame. And those aren't wrong. I actually would argue those are very normal feelings. Those are
Right.
very human experiences to feel. So I do not think we try to teach it differently in Christian higher education, but from my experience, it's been hard to do that. Even at times where I felt like I've been nice, I've wondered to myself, did I push hard enough? Did I challenge my students enough? If my students left these classes and felt like, oh, Dr. Shannon is so nice and kind,
Yeah.
and he tries to include everyone, right? While yes, aspects of that I think are validating on a personal level,
Hmm.
am I truly doing the work of responding to equity and seeing how we're complicit and engaging in acts of oppression?
Right.
Right?
Right.
Like I don't know if I can say that.
Yeah. No,
Yeah,
this is really good from what you're describing. You're saying that the content of what we teach might not be different. Just
yeah.
because we're a Christian higher education doesn't mean that we teach something different, but
Mhm.
the motivation for teaching what we do is grounded in our faith, right? Like thinking about Jesus's example, what we're called to seek justice, right? And yeah, part of that is being kind, but also part of that is loving others by demonstrating the truth. So I
Mhm.
really appreciate that. I've been asking this question a lot about how does cross-cultural psychology look different at an undergraduate level? Because at the graduate level, as you might have experienced, teaching students might be looking for a different type of an integration. But for me, I've noticed, at least at SPU, more and more students are not looking for faith integration. The reason that
Mm.
they're on a Christian campus is because people are nice or nicer than at a larger institution. Professors are kinder, smaller classroom is better. All these are good reasons, but what does the faith aspect of this look like? That's the question that I've been grappling with a lot. I've experimented with integrating biblical examples into my classrooms. Like when we talk about self-construal, quoting Bible verses that talk about the
Yeah.
importance of individual functions, but also the body being important.
I think this aspect of faith integration is tricky, right? Because it's codified in the ways of how faculty are evaluated. Some students might be looking for that, but I feel like more students choose our program in spite of it, despite it. And that part is always unique for me to try to reconcile of how do I show this genuinely in my
Right.
classroom? How do I
Yeah.
share a Bible verse authentically that I
Right.
feel like represents the course content
Hmm.
or just reflects just who I am? And also, how do I do that in a way that doesn't impose my values onto students? So almost every time I feel there's also that imposter syndrome or that second guessing aspect. Anytime I integrate faith, I find myself doing a lot of explanation just because I'm like, not everyone will agree. Like, I know this is not meaningful for everyone. I'm doing a lot of over explanation because it's wanting to be attentive to the reality that people, not everyone there ascribes to a Christian belief or a Christian
Right.
faith. So I'm like, but shouldn't I be saying these things? Am I lacking conviction when I say this? All these things come to my
Yeah.
mind. But I think kind of going back to what you shared, when even demonstrating aspects of self-control and
Mhm.
showing interdependency throughout the scriptures, there are ways to incorporate both. And I find within my diversity course, a bit tricky, especially given religious oppression,
Yeah.
specifically Christianity has been at the forefront of that. So even just trying to integrate my Christian faith, but
Yeah.
also acknowledge the harm perpetuated in the name of it.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that part is hard because students can then label you or label me as attacking Christianity rather quickly. Like they could jump to that conclusion that
Yeah.
if you honestly reflect on our privilege associated with being a Christian in the United States, right? Then students many times quickly jump to, oh, here goes Dr. Kim again with his agenda where he's attacking Christianity.
Yeah.
And then some students feel like I do too much Christian faith integration, especially in the area of DEI. To do this Christian integration well is really challenging, but I think very necessary to do.
Yeah.
I just have a few more questions. I know that you are relatively new to SPU, right? You've been at SPU for how many years now,
This is
Jordan?
my third year.
If you were to give advice to a recent PhD who's starting out at a Christian higher education institution, what advice might you have?
Advice I might have to faculty fresh out of PhD.
Yeah.
Well, first thing I'm probably going to say to them is congratulations on landing a tenure track position.
Yeah. Not a given. Yeah.
Not a given,
Yeah.
right? And I think it's important to, in many ways, it would be very similar to how I would advise someone who's pursuing a faculty position that's not Christian higher ed. And that is, what does the institution believe? What is the institution promoting? And what are some of the expectations of the faculty? Within Christian higher education, there's going to be a lot of emphasis on morals and ethics amongst faculty. And I think being prepared for that is you just want to be privy to that information. So really research and analyze just what the requirements are, or what the expectations are going to be for you just to be seen as a good standing member of that place. There are so many things that I didn't think about with stepping into SPU just because of my own faith background, and talk about Christian privilege. For example, like the current situation that we're in with lifestyle expectations. I remember during my cross-campus interview where it's all about your faith. I was the only person of color in that interview. So that was some kind of pressure of like with having a bunch of white folks ask me about my faith, just uncomfortable. But taking that all together, even in that interview, I didn't even hesitate to talk about my heterosexual marriage. I didn't hesitate to talk about the different religious authors like C.S. Lewis and John Piper and all. I didn't hesitate to mention those names because one, they were congruent with my values, but at the same time, that's part of the privilege, is that I didn't even interrogate or analyze or think, oh, what if I didn't ascribe to heterosexual identity? It's things like that. After being on this side for 3 years now, I wish I had interrogated a little bit more, challenged a little bit more in terms of how can we make this a more inclusive environment. That would be my advice. Frankly, so we were hiring in our program for another faculty member last year, and we got some folks who were interested and who had applied and stuff. But there was one person who I was connected with from Florida who was finishing up their doctorate, and faculty of color, great school counselor, educator, great experience. And they were very pointed, and I appreciate they asked, they said, hey, so SPU is a Christian institution. I'm not Christian. Would that be an issue with me stepping into this? And I had to be very candid. I said, hey, totally. Yeah, I hear you. Not everyone ascribes to the system. And I will say, if you wanted to work here, that would be an issue. And unfortunately, which limits our application pool and it really hurts us in that stance. But I totally get where you're coming from. They were very understanding, but I just felt like, dang it, a barrier to finding such a quality candidate.
I mean, that's such a hard conversation to have as a department chair, but also not only someone who does not identify as Christian, but someone who does say, oh, I am a Christian, but then SPU, through their faculty interview and the cross-campus interview committee, determined that the faith is not a good match. And then having to deliver that feedback to the person, that can be really challenging. Hey, we know that you're Christian, but then maybe not the type of Christian that SPU is looking for. So I think that can be really difficult.
And how can that not be layered, right? There's obviously some type of homogenization that you're looking for in Christian identity. And particularly for me, when I did that interview, I'm used to being in predominantly white spaces, but sometimes it does make me check myself when I'm like, how am I this comfortable in this space? With that interview, when I was doing it, one of the very first things I noticed is that faculty of color, like an applicant of color, and every person, it was 5 people, was white, asking me about my background and my faith. And I didn't know what to think of that. I still felt comfortable speaking about my faith because I feel very grounded in my identities, but there was something that didn't sit well with me about that.
I've been part of the cross-campus interview committee before, and I wish they were more consistently intentional about the makeup of that committee, not only in terms of gender, but also in terms of racial and ethnic identity. All right, Jordan, thank you so much for talking with me.
This was awesome, Paul. I really appreciated being able to talk with you about these things. I look forward to, I guess, seeing this recording or being able to share this recording with folks. I think it's a necessary conversation. It's definitely a hot button issue in our country.
It is. And thank you for doing the good work, despite the challenges that are coming up for us and we continue to experience. Let's persevere.
Thank you for listening to the Cross Cultural Psych podcast with Dr. Paul Youngbin Kim. We hope this content was meaningful. If you enjoyed the podcast, we invite you to write a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Also, let us know what you'd like to see covered in future episodes. We hope you'll join us next time.